Okay, here we are, part 3 in this Grisaille painting tutorial. What we have accomplished is that we've filled up the canvas, which is to say we've really finished up the block-in phase of the project. In a sense, that covers our bases. Our priorities were really to get everything started up and at the same level. Now that we've gotten to that place, however, we really need to drill down on what's important, which is to say, this portrait is of this model and we need to express her features, the light that's falling across the form of her face, and also all the intricate things that we think are so interesting about what's surrounding her. This is where we can even get into kind of a conceptual realm, which is to say, when I look at a portrait, I'm not only looking at the eyes, nose, forehead, and features of the model. I'm very much focused on how the form of the model is reacting to the light source that I've applied to it. So I find it particularly interesting to treat these different surfaces, her hair, her skin, and her clothing, not as totally separate entities, but as forms that are bound together by the light source that's hitting them. This will have particular technical expressions that happen a little bit later in the process, and I'm going to talk very specifically about those at the time that they're being implemented. Let's say then that the breadth of the painting has been expressed and we're ready now to drill down into something a lot more subtle and a lot more expressive of the concept and the model that we're working with. Starting out our painting day at this stage, we need to make some pretty clear choices about what to do. If you're familiar with oil painting, what you're going to notice about this picture is that in fact the oil paint, which is a part of this dried layer, is a little bit sunken in. You can notice it most here and here. These dark areas, rather than being glossy and rich and exactly looking the way that they did when I painted them, they have dried to this matte finish. Now that on its own is nothing to really worry about. It's a natural part of the oil painting process. But we are in a moment where we can ask the question, should I oil out my painting or should I simply paint over this layer? The answer to that question is going to differ from artist to artist. But I will tell you now the criteria that I use to make that choice. If I am intent upon painting over everything in the picture, then I will not oil out. If I want to simply go in and work on one specific area or make some touch-ups to an edge or a transition, then definitely in those situations I'm going to oil out rather than repainting everything. You want the surface of your painting to be deliberate and you want your choices to be reflected on that surface. And so the very particular way that I enjoy slightly more transparent shadows would mean that I need to be prepared to oil out my picture and make only small adjustments to the transition along the cheek, for instance, rather than repainting the entire shadow and entire light shape in order to finish that area. It boils down to understanding where you are in the timeline of your painting. If you're quite near the beginning, probably you don't want to oil out. But if, within my process, I'm all the way over here, just about to finish my painting, I'm definitely going to oil out so that I can carefully take those next few steps on the way to the finish line. There isn't a lot more for me to say at this moment of the process because essentially we're going to be repeating what we did at the beginning of the second video. We're going to re-establish the block-in. Let's pause here for a moment and talk about what's going on in the painting right now. I've done something here that you haven't seen me do before in this Grisaille painting. I've taken a relatively light mixture of paint and scumbled it throughout various areas within the light shape of the painting. Even places like this, where in fact eventually there is going to be a rather dark shadow. Now there are several different reasons for doing this. One is that with lead white, I feel like I tend to darken down the light shape of my painting while I'm creating transitions and working on the overall sense of form in the picture. That means that in areas like this, which are really quite light, I'm making a kind of course correction. I know that as the painting day goes on, I'm going to have to darken certain planes as they turn away from the light source. But I want the starting point to be a little bit lighter so that I can preserve the luminosity in an area like this, rather than starting out with a mid-tone and darkening from there, leaving behind a painting that overall does not have a very light and airy effect. This area here is quite different though. The reason that I've chosen to scumble over that is because I don't want to get married to the edges of the shapes that I described there in the first place. Hair for me is kind of an ever-evolving subject. This is something else that comes from me working from life primarily when I was a student. I wasn't used to seeing the same shape of hair every time the model sat down. For me, it was like waves in the ocean, constantly changing. Every time I looked at the model, he or she would have a different shape in their hair. And so that led me to look at patterns of gesture rather than creating a literal interpretation of the individual hairs on a model's head. This, I think, is a really great strength for you to focus on as you're working on this model's hair. Try to describe the planes of it in relationship to the light source, as well as the movement of individual sections within the hair. Don't get caught up in the surface texture, but rather look at its gestural movement and the pattern of shadow and light that falls across it. In this way, we will succeed in turning this photograph into a painting rather than simply a copy of a photograph. So to reiterate, what this scumble in the hair has done really is just to slightly wash away a little bit of the concrete sense of the shapes that I designed there, so that I can still use the discovery of shape and design that was there, and then of course improve on it, but not be inhibited by its presence. Something else that you can notice is that a lot of our focus really is going to be here at the moment. The exception, of course, being this area on the right. I mentioned before in an earlier video about how I wanted the air and the depth behind the model to feel apparent via the comparison in between a transparent passage like this and a more concrete, opaquely painted passage like this. Not touching this area in the background is my way of allowing the comparison between this area and it to become more and more distant from each other. The more opaque and subtle this becomes, the more deep and atmospheric this background, which is totally abstract, becomes in relationship to it. It's this kind of predictive strategy that is usually missing when a student's going through the process. Knowing that, left alone, this background will eventually fit perfectly into the reality being created on this canvas. It just requires patience and foresight to leave it as it is. You'll also notice conspicuously absent in this process the pre-mixtures that I used in the first two videos. They are replaced by a facsimile of them, which I have mixed only using my brush. This more improvisational, open palette is made possible that I've really locked in most of the big value decisions I need to make within the painting. The light shape has its own identity, the shadow shape has its own identity, and because I don't need to establish the value in really large areas like this, I don't need a larger and more consistent pool of paint to draw from. It could be said at the same time, if you're a beginning painter and you're lacking that sense of facility with your brush to just take these guys here and whip up exactly the right mixture, perhaps you want to stick to making pre-mixtures. I did that all throughout my education, and really it was nothing but a benefit. So from this point onward, I think you can pretty much take it as you choose. Your assignment at this moment, though, is to continue on the elaboration of that design that we're making in the hair, and also begin to place the dark halftones that are going to make our choices within the rest of the light shape a lot easier. We have a lot more painting left ahead of us today, and so we do need to take care of these things in the beginning so that they don't haunt us in the end. Going back for a moment to where we started the day, we can reflect upon where this statement of purpose has led us to. Eventually, we find ourselves here. A lot of transitions are working. We need simply look at the form on the model's nose to understand the progress that has been made. That being said, this for me is a really slippery stage. We've started to get quite soft and quite subtle in terms of the relationships in between halftone planes in our light shape. And usually, even for me, this stage can sometimes veer into a more structureless, overly softened identity. The only thing that I've found to really work is to simply push through it. Focus on clarifying your halftone planes and always be looking for the mistakes. Case in point, let's look at this area right here. What I find looking at this is I have too light a value out at the edges of this form. What that means essentially is that I'm misrepresenting the orientation of this plane in relationship to the light source. By painting it as light as I have, I'm effectively saying that it's facing just about the same direction as this plane. Now, of course, we understand implicitly it's not. There's a pretty massive and categorical plane shift that happens here, rendering the side plane of the cheek much darker, certainly than the highlighted plane of the zygomatic bone, but also of other up-facing planes in the general vicinity. What's going to need to happen eventually is that I will have to key down this plane in order to help the form turn under and eventually into shadow. We can also look at areas like this, which effectively for me, I would consider to be a mistake. I've chosen values too light there in relationship to the other side of the face. We have to remember that in fact the head itself is round. It is a rounded volume, and if we have light coming in from one side, we can't have the same value on one side as we do on the other. In that way, the value I'm using on that right-hand side of the face is contradicting what the true nature of the volume of the head is in this case, and I need to fix that. Another thing that you can do in this stage to problem solve has to do with the natural pushing and pulling that is oil painting. So I'll tell you exactly what I mean by that. The push-pull is essentially the way that painting transitions takes place. Naturally, you put a dark value next to a light one. In order to blend them together, we need to push one over the top of the other and pull back to the edge of that shape. Back and forth it goes until eventually we arrive at that place that gives us really the sense of transition we were looking for to begin with. It's much less paint by numbers and a lot more trusting in your natural ability to draw and maintain structure while keeping things soft. But it doesn't always go exactly as we want it. So we need to pull back that sense of structure, and that means bringing in slightly harder edges and clearer angle breaks. You can almost think of this as doing once again exactly what we did at the start of the day. We blocked in all the shadow edges with straight lines and structure to create complexity and design that would serve as a foundation for all of the softening and subtle transitions that we would have to make throughout the course of the painting day. So this is about as far as I was able to take this painting today. While far from being perfect, it's definitely an improvement on what it was after the second day. We have been able to make some progress in terms of turning the form, creating more specific design within the features, and also increasing the sense of luminosity and brightness in the lightest planes of the model. In addition to that, we've been able to maintain a sense of softness in particular areas of the painting, without which we would have a much more difficult time making our way into the next phase of this project. In fact, let me pause for a moment and talk specifically about this. A mistake that I have seen so many times that I can't even tell you is to leave an edge like this too sharp at the end of a painting day. Where I think that it comes from is somewhere in the back of our minds we are telling ourselves, I will get to that later. I'll do that in the next layer. In oil paint though, it's important that we embrace this ethic of not doing things halfway. Halfway in an oil painting can really inhibit you from finishing the painting all the way. This is why I keep bringing up this idea of being deliberate and having a plan. A plan means that I should be able to use my time wisely so that I don't run out of energy or enthusiasm, leaving behind artifacts in my painting that are going to make my future self have a much more difficult time moving forward. Now, of course, nobody's perfect, certainly not me. There are definitely going to be things that I'll look at and say, well, what if? What if I had taken that sharp edge out? What if I had left that area just a little bit lighter? We hold up perfection as an ideal so that hopefully we push ourselves beyond where we think we can go. Painting really is not at all about perfection. Greatness in art, in fact, has very little to do with perfection. It has everything to do with expression. Now here, for instance, we are making just a very humble study of a model's portrait. But it's also an opportunity that we can take to push our skill and execution a little bit further. So before you wrap up today, your assignment is going to be to take one last pass, one last check to see that some of the edges that you left behind might be softened a little bit, to see that some of the values that you painted a little bit too light can be darkened, or vice versa. We're going to do our future selves a favor, and at the end of this stage, bring it to a place that's going to leave us in a place where we're very excited to come back to the painting because it offers so much opportunity for advancement. And this is another thing about those hard edges. I think that there's something very psychological in it. Every time I see in a painting a hard edge like this, I think to myself about how much work it's going to be for me to soften that, especially if it's already dry. Conversely, I find that a soft edge is just dying to be painted into. Now, whether that is an idiosyncratic quirk that I have or something universally that we all share, I don't know. But I can say that over time, it definitely affects the feeling that I have and the motivation I have to go back into my painting. That's all for now, and we're going to pick this up in the next stage.